one generative LLM with June Yang, and a biomarker workshop as well. Students, please remember to sign in, and there will be a lunch with the speaker directly following seminar, and you can follow Aria over to Rate Hall if you want to join that. Register for PAA, please submit your travel grant applications if you are going. And I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Lively to introduce our speaker today.
So it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Mark Henderson today. Mark is a friend and colleague that I've known for 30 years, which actually shocked me when I thought about it. Mark is a professor of public policy at Northeastern University Oakland campus. He's trained in environmental science as well as Chinese studies. He holds a BA from Williams, an MA from Harvard, and a PhD in environmental studies and public policy from UC Berkeley. He's a very versatile scholar. His interests include environmental policy in the United States and China, urbanization and land use planning, global climate change, and policy applications of geographic information science. Mark has made pioneering contributions in the field of digital humanities, and I'm thinking of his work on the Chinese Historical GIS project, which was kind of a monumental leap forward in the use of GIS in Chinese history. And he's also done some interesting studies with a collaborator on the spread of mosques in China from the Tang Dynasty to the 20th century. More relevant to today's talk, and the reason I know Mark in the first place, is that in the 1990s, Mark took a position as a kind of a cartographer and GIS manager with my mentor, the late G. William Skinner, who was then professor of anthropology at UC Davis. And Mark soon became a full collaborator and co-author with Skinner. And it's no exaggeration to say that today Mark is the keeper and interpreter of Skinner's intellectual legacy as it relates to regional systems theory in Chinese society. So today we'll see this all on display as Mark presents a paper entitled, let's see, when Geographies Collide, Hierarchical Regional Systems in China's Great Leap Famine. So please welcome Mark Henderson.
Thanks, Bill. That was a very complimentary introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm glad for all of you being here on this beautiful sunny day in Seattle. It's always like this, right? And that you'd spend the hour inside with me, I do appreciate. Let me share my screen and make sure the sound is off. There we go. Well, I can start talking anyway. So as Bill indicated, we got to know each other through the auspices of Dr. G. William Skinner at UC Davis, involved in collecting, assembling historic and contemporary data on China. Bill was involved in the China in Time and Space project, which evolved in some ways into the CHGIS project, and has become the keeper of Dr. Skinner's map library that's now here at the University of Washington. I helped a little with that, and then with the digital repository of Dr. Skinner's statistical and cartographic data at Harvard. And so this project that I'm going to talk about today draws on work that had been started in Davis, drawing on some of Professor Skinner's insights, and then advanced through another UW connection, Bill Lively's former student, Tsai Yong, now at the University of North Carolina. And then a third collaborator, Anthony Garneau, Australian, who got his undergraduate degree at Beida in physics, oddly enough, and then became a scholar of Chinese history as well. So the three of us in the 10, 15 years ago started thinking about how to continue this project with the available data, and with this worked a minute ago, didn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. How to continue this project beyond what Professor Skinner had gotten to. Struggled with the data, struggled with the concepts, and now I'm going to try to explain the theoretical framework for it, and then some of the results that we've gotten to this point. And I'm actually really interested in, since I've got demographers and other experts in other areas in the room, what makes sense and what doesn't to you in this endeavor. And we do have the screen up. I just have to get back to the beginning. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about hierarchy and geography. So you're probably all used to hierarchical geographic systems, whether you call them by that name or not. So in the US, if you look for census data, it's organized by the nation, then by the state, then by counties, and then by, say, census tracts or blocks or other nested polygon, as we say in GIS, discrete areas that contain a population and that you can report some statistics about. In China, the equivalent units would be the nation, provinces, counties, and then townships. And in a less bureaucratic way, information flows up from those lower level units and is aggregated and reported to the top. And then policies are implemented, sent down. Sometimes those are quotas. How much grain should you produce? How much taxes you should collect? And in the case of the Great Lakes Famine, what kind of collectivization should happen? How many units are you supposed to create for people to be organized in? So that is a nested hierarchical regional system. Bill Skinner wanted us to pay more attention to what I would call, I don't think he would have used the term, fuzzy systems. Systems that don't have sharp boundaries because people are not constrained by walls or by their administrative assignment. And one of those would be where you go to shop. So Skinner started, as you can read in the Sichuan Field Notes book that Bill Lavely and Stephen Harrell edited, by bicycling around the countryside in Sichuan province and asking people where they went to market. And when he was close to the town he was staying in, people said, well, I go to that town, that's where the market is. And when he went a few miles away near another market town, people said they went to that market town. And somewhere in the middle, people said, well, sometimes this one and sometimes that one. And then when they'd say, well, where do you go to buy special things? Maybe furniture, maybe bridal apparel, something like that. Oh, well, you have to go to the bigger market for that. And he found that there was a regular schedule of these markets that was set up so that the smaller markets didn't overlap with the bigger markets, so that the merchants and the customers could get to that bigger market. And what he uncovered there was a hierarchy of markets, spatially arranged for the convenience of both the consumers and the peddlers, the tradespeople. And in his own telling, he knew immediately that this was an example of Walter Pistaller's idea of central place theory, that the towns or the markets were providing services to a hinterland, and that those areas were going to overlap in a fuzzy way because there wasn't a wall separating one market area from the next. So nowadays you can think of that. Since I was coming to Seattle, I hope a Starbucks example is relevant, but you might need to go to Starbucks every day for your coffee. It's good, but it's not so good that you'd go really far out of your way to get it, right? So Starbucks makes sure there's a daily coffee shop near everything that you need to be. As a consumer, you might go to one day and you might go to another other day, whatever fits your schedule. But if you're going to a grocery store, say once a week, there's one there too. So you can get that basic need met along with other needs that you need less frequently. And then maybe you go to Target or some other big box store every month or so to stock up on supplies, and there's a Starbucks there too. And so you can get your needs met at different levels of the hierarchy, and it's a fuzzy hierarchy. Now, from the point of view of Starbucks as a corporation, I don't know this, but I'm pretty sure that they have a nested hierarchy where somebody's a manager for this region, and they're making sure there's enough cups and coffee beans and staff and so forth down and it's not at all fuzzy what they're responsible for making work. So as an organizational matter, a nested hierarchy; as a consumer behavior matter, a fuzzy hierarchy. And that might be good for the marketing people. For our point of view, it's about the spatial structure. Where do people go? Who do they meet? when they get to the market, they don't just buy food and go home. They sit at the tea shop and they chat and they exchange news and they maybe arrange weddings and are reinforcing the ties of a community when a system like that is working well. So that's when it's working well. So as I said, Bill Skinner wrote about this. He did his field work in 1949, which those of you who know China is right on the eve, in fact, right after the declaration of the People's Republic. And he was there as the Communist Army marched into Sichuan province and took over. And eventually they noticed an American anthropologist wandering around and asked him kindly to not do that anymore. His field notes were presumed lost for all of these years. And then after he passed, Steve found that they weren't, and Bill found that they weren't lost and edited them for so that everyone can read them now. In that book, the map on the right is Skinner's field map from that bicycle around. The shaded area in the middle is his estimation of the market area of the town that he was staying near. And on the left, that's Walter Kristaller's schematic diagram of central place theory, that you have markets at different levels serving overlapping areas depending on their level in the urban hierarchy. And so that idea took root in Skinner's mind, and first at the level of marketing and social structure, describing this as a system that would explain a lot of the spatial arrangement of Chinese society across agrarian areas. I think in his mind, he thought this could probably apply to a lot of agrarian societies around the world. And he did later work on France and Japan to apply this theory. But then if he took that up a level and said, well, if we've got these little nested, interlocking nested marketing systems at the lower level, what would that look like at the level of the nation, at the level of the Qing Empire? And so he took this idea of standard market towns as being sort of the root level, and then built up a hierarchy of cities till you get to the capital, Beijing, or places like now Shanghai or Guangzhou. And counted, well, how many of the cities are there at the top? What's their largest area that they're sort of the dominant economic force on the landscape? And then down a level, the regional metropolises and regional cities each have successively smaller areas. And this is all detailed in his 1977 book, but the important number to take away here was that there were about 39,000 standard market areas nested within 9 macro regions in China. Okay, so 39,000 market systems. And no one anthropologist was going to visit all of them, but that you could get a sense of how the whole system would work, imputing this from some educated guesses about the populations of different cities and counties back in the Qing dynasty, and the informed by Kristaller, the likely ratios of city populations to the areas that were served by those centers in more core areas around the bigger cities, and then more peripheral areas within each of those 9 macro regions. Okay, so remember 39,000. Bottom line from his first study was this. Administrative units are going to be a nested hierarchy. A township reports to a county, reports to a province. Market systems are not nested that way. So people in 2 different market systems might go to this major city or major market for furniture and so forth. But if you're on this side of the market, you might actually go over this one. So it doesn't mean that everyone at the same market is going to go up to the same level and same next level of the hierarchy. So these dashed lines here, I can't reach that far to point out. Do I have a mouse? You have a mouse, okay. So this is the market town that he was at, and everybody in that polygon outlined by the dark line would go to that market on average. But if you're in the upper corner here, you tended to go to this bigger market. If you're in the lower corner here, you tended to go to this bigger market. So fuzzy, but hierarchical, okay? So what happens if you're the new communist authorities and you're wanting to implement a socialist market system to govern the production of grain and the allocation of food to an industrial program? This market system is not very legible to you. Skinner hadn't done the study. There were some Chinese anthropologists earlier who started to get a clue of this and write about it, but it wasn't at the top of the mind for the communist economic planners. Like other places where governments have come in and tried to organize economies, and I'm thinking of James Scott writing about the colonizers in Indonesia, They see the market, or they see the landscape sort of like you see a forest. It's dark, it's got lots of trees all over the place, got underbrush, and it's not very clear when you look at that. Well, how many board feet of timber are in that forest? Let's just organize this and get the trees planted in nice straight rows, and then we can count them and we can measure them, and then we'll manage the forest to optimize for timber production. So it makes it more legible. It makes it fit in a hierarchy. You can collect the data on the forest production, very nice. But what you miss in all of that were all the other things the forest was doing besides producing timber. You miss the non-timber forest products. You miss the habitat for creatures, some of which are food, some of which are just making the world a better place. And so by destroying or systematizing, making the forest legible, you miss out on the other non-measured factors that were there in the forest. In the case of the communists coming in and trying to reorganize Chinese society and the Chinese economy into a legible hierarchical system, they lose some of those social ties, or they break some of those social ties that make society more resilient to disaster. So, but not everybody here was going to be a Chinese history expert. I apologize if this is either too basic or too obscure for your interest. But People's Republic established in 1949. One of the first endeavors is land reform, to break up the land holdings of rich landlords and let the farmers, the peasants as they were called, own their own land, and encourage them to produce for themselves and respond to market incentives, and grain production rises. But these are communists. They're also interested in collective efforts. So they start very soon organizing mutual aid teams. So you and your neighbors get together, and maybe you can afford to buy better tools. You can have a larger plot of land, more efficient, more production. They start into the Soviet-style 5-year planning program in 1953, and they continue to accelerate the scale and the pace of collective production. Up until about 1958, when Mao says, we're not going fast enough, we need to make even bigger collectives. We're going to call them people's communes, and that's going to be the way that we really accelerate China's industrialization, because we're going to have more efficient agriculture, we're going to free up more surplus to feed to the industrial sector, and we're going to, the idea was catch up with Britain and, or exceed Britain and catch up with the United States in steel production. From the early 21st century, that actually seems like, yeah, done, but it didn't happen this way. So that progress of expanding collectivization over time looks something like this. So at first we had millions of mutual aid teams, hundreds of millions of farming families, millions of mutual aid teams. Those get consolidated into about 500,000, a little over 500,000 agricultural producers cooperatives, which is sort of this higher level of collective organization. Then those expand further out into the countryside. They get about 700,000 advanced agricultural producers cooperatives, with now, instead of 20 to 40 families, they've got 100 to 300 families. So big groups. I don't know if you have any of you have kids in elementary school, but how many students are there in an elementary school? How many families are there? And how many of them do you know? We were talking earlier about the role of PTAs and things in supporting schools in California and Washington. And you get to know people. You see them at PTA meetings and fundraisers and stuff. You definitely know 40 other families. Do you know 100 or 300 other families? Maybe, probably not that many. So hard to know when you're working with that big of a group if everybody's pulling their share, who has what resources, who has what special skills and so forth. It gets a little harder to manage. But from the top, from Beijing, it's like, oh, there are only that many now. There used to be millions. We can keep track of 700,000. We've got some big ledger graph paper. We can do that. But Mao says, no, that's not enough, not advanced enough in collectivization. We want to shrink that number of units and expand their size. And that's where the people's communes come in around 1958. 5,000 or so households. The number varies widely from province to province, place to place, but really big units. These are small towns worth of population, and only 26,000 or so of these nationwide in the agricultural parts of China. So the number I asked you to remember a minute ago was 39,000. So we now have rather fewer people's communes in a nested hierarchy than we had standard market towns in a fuzzy hierarchy. And that is what sets the stage for what we see in the Great Leap Forward. So the Great Leap Forward, again, this push to collectivize and accelerate industrialization, beat the drums, as the poster says, and propel China into a more modern future. And this is what happened to grain production. It's been going up with each stage of collectivization, and then in 1959, we get this start to dip. And turns out that it's not a terribly efficient way to organize your labor. Why did this happen? Books have been written on this. A bunch of things happened. Some of it was the allocation of farm labor to go off and do other things like build huge infrastructure projects. Some of which may be rational in the long term, but grain production suffered. Some of it may be the adoption of agricultural techniques, told everybody to do the same thing. They call it the application of one broad brush in Chinese, and those techniques had negative returns. And then there's the actual expropriation of grain, communes being told, you have to deliver this much grain to the city to support industrialization, and it doesn't leave enough for the population itself to be sustained. And under those circumstances, they're going to produce less as well. So despite the poster saying 1960 is going to be the best year, it turns out 1960 is the worst year post-revolution in terms of grain production. So Bill Skinner was writing in the later 60s when he wrote up his field notes from 1949 and published on social structure. And the third part of that article talks about what he infers from the reduction in the number of units, communes, to lower than the number of standard market towns. What he didn't have in the 1960s, what Western scholars didn't really see until at least the 80s, was the demographic impact of that reduction in grain production and everything that went along with it forward. And we see it here in this age-sex pyramid from the 1982 census, this shortfall in the number of births or surviving population who would have been born during the period of the Great Leap. So you got a sort of standard age-sex profile, and then you get this squeezing in the people who would be 21, 22, 23 years old. So either they were never born or they didn't survive to be counted in 1982. We don't know if they died at age 1 or they died at age 19, because that's not in there, but they aren't in the census. And that was when the wider world got to get a sense, not just of people who died in the famine, but the demographic impact, people who weren't born or didn't survive to adulthood. How to measure that? This is one of our continuing discussions. Do we compare it to the baseline of the years immediately before that? We try to sort of draw a linear trend, what it would have been. You see that it bulges out just below that, the 20-year-olds in 1982. That's a bit of a catch-up. Families who maybe lost children or didn't have them saying, wait, we wanted children. So you've got a bigger cohort right after that. So for this study, we just did the simplest thing of saying the 3 years of the leap compared to a few years before that, 1954 to 56, before the leap type policy really started to take effect. But you could quibble with that. You could come up with different or more sophisticated methods as well. All right. Now we're interested in how that played out across the Chinese landscape in different provinces. A lot of the political scientists have focused on the province, partly because we have the most information about it. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that two provinces in particular had the greatest impact of the famine and of the reduction in births. So Anhui province, which is just inland from Shanghai, and then Sichuan province up the river, up the Yangtze River. Overall, for that cohort, we calculated an impact of 45% for Anhui, 40% for Sichuan, and the next three provinces are down, at 30%. So it seems like something different is happening there, and political scientists ran with that story, and they looked at the provincial level leaders there, the governors, the party secretaries, and said, oh, look at those guys. They're really emphasizing the Maoist line on collectivization. If you look at their individual histories, they were sort of promoted through the party ranks quickly rather than some of the other governors who were maybe more, had come up through civil service or through the army or something like that. So maybe there's a difference. Maybe these party leaders were really promoting this collectivization, and that's what explains the impact. But we have data down to prefectural and county level. And so when we disaggregate that data, we see a somewhat different picture. So the range of Great Leap demographic impact for provinces was about 5% to 45%. The range for prefectures is negative 1.8, which means there were actually more offspring during the Great Leap, slightly, to 61.3. And then for counties, even more on the left, negative 39, up to 100%. So counties where there were 0 births recorded or surviving births in the 1982 census from that area. And more to the point, those numbers aren't just concentrated in Anhui and Sichuan. So you find cases that are worse than Anhui in every province, in some prefectures or some counties. So it was not just a story of 2 provinces getting carried away. So now we've got local variation, and that's a puzzle to explain, and it can't be just explained by the governors or the party secretaries of the province. All right, so Sayang and I worked on this with Anthony Garneau, and a few years ago we presented in Hong Kong. We tried to apply Skinner's core periphery model, and we weren't satisfied that we were getting a consistent story across China, and we really thanked Bill for his comments at the time that we really have to rethink this in terms of how Skinner would have approached this problem. But meanwhile, a couple other scholars have put out their interpretations, and I found this one by Elizabeth Gooch at the USDA to be an interesting one. She thought, let's look at how this famine compares to other famines around the world. And one of the common patterns of most famines in places where it's caused by natural disaster is that areas with more rugged terrain see worse outcomes. So it's either they are more exposed to the sources of natural disaster, drought or flood or whatever it is, and or they're harder to reach to get relief to. So you expect more rugged, more mountainous areas to show the worst effects. When you take that data and put the Chinese census results for prefectures and calculate the terrain ruggedness of the prefectures, she finds the opposite result, that actually the more rugged areas were protected from the famine, and the areas that were close to the cities and easy to get to were the ones that had the most extreme results. And so it's easy to build a story around that too. If this is a famine being driven not primarily by natural disasters or the failure of relief, but by a government that's trying to extract grain from nearby areas and get it to the city, that would make sense. Okay, so we replicated that. She used, interestingly, the China Historic GIS boundaries for prefectures, which apply to the Qing dynasty. We, I think, did a better job of recreating prefecture boundaries for approximately 1958. And we get a few different, slightly different results, particularly, and one of them is in Anhui, which is sort of a critical case here, where we're not really seeing a significant difference. But I've got the coefficients and significance levels in the paper, but you know, there's something to be seen there, but it's only at the prefectural level. It might not even been the right prefectural boundaries. So can we take this down a level as well? So we try it out for counties and for townships, using a sample of the 1990 census, where we have a household sample and a individual sample combined to be about a 2% sample of the Chinese population, aggregated to the township level. Now, Taiyang, my colleague, would like me to emphasize that a sample is a sample. So we don't have every birth, we only have a sample of births represented here. And then on the GIS side, I would say we also only have approximate locations of townships, right? There are a lot of them. There were 70 or 80,000 of them then. We only have 50,000 of them mapped with some confidence. And so we're being a little loose here with the data, and that's where I would appreciate help or ideas about how to make this better. But we find there, at this level, we're finding even more discrepancies from Elizabeth Gooch's findings at the provincial level. So it's not entirely sure that she's right on this, but there are cases where the terrain seems to matter. Okay, and then another scholar, Chris Bramall, will describe himself as someone who's pushing back on the argument that Chairman Mao and the top leaders, the national leaders of the Communist Party of China at the time, were responsible for setting the tone. And he wants to draw more attention to the local leaders, not even at the governors at the provincial level, but down at the township, the commune level, for them being the ones who got carried away, overzealously implemented the collectivization policies, and could be held responsible for the disastrous outcomes in their location. His paper says that he doesn't see a spatial pattern. He sees spatial randomness in the severity of the famine, and that if it were centrally organized, you would expect a pattern. You would expect a pattern that that towns near transportation, near rivers, near railroads would be uniformly hard hit, because that's where it would be easy to extract grain from, and places further away would be less hard hit. And he doesn't see that. So we mapped it at the county level, and we agree we don't see that it's the severity of the famine tracks with the railroads, which are on the map, doesn't track with the rivers that would have been used for transporting grain. But we're trying to think like Skinner. Spatial randomness is probably not where we're going to go. So what spatial patterns, what spatial logic can we find from the available data? And so buried in the census, each province has an ID number, each county has an ID number, each township has an ID number, and embedded in those ID numbers are codes that indicate sort of the classification of the county or the township within the administrative system. It's the second to the last or the third to the last digit of the ID number for each of those levels. We put those ID numbers in order by their average urbanization rate. 0 would be the most urban, sort of the county seat in an urban area, say, okay, well, do we in fact find that it's spatially random, or is there some logic here that reveals itself? And looking across the bottom of the township administrative type from 0 to 9, we see how the Great Lake demographic impact gets better. The numbers go down. And then from 9 on up to 5, we see how it gets it rises up again. So what's the difference between a 9 classification township type and a 4 or a 1 or a 3 that are less on average urbanized? Has to do with their position in the structure of getting quotas to deliver grain back up into the system. So it's like, okay, so it's not random. There's a spatial logic here in terms of the classification of the townships, maybe a little less so of the counties. You wouldn't want to be in county type 1, township type 9 though. There aren't very many of these, but these were urbanized areas with like special state farms or something like that. And it seems like these were like particularly asked to sacrifice for the greater good, to deliver their grain to the, in this case, fairly nearby cities that were industrializing. So, and that's completely out of order of the rest of the township type 9s. All right, so what would Skinner have done next? He would have said, well, let's consider the regional structure. In Sichuan province falls mainly into the upper Yangtze macro region in Skinner's scheme. It's sort of the catchment of the major rivers. The name of the province is 4 rivers, Sichuan, that flow into the upper Yangtze basin. And Skinner had done the central place analysis, assigning each of the cities, which we then impute to townships, their rank in an urban hierarchy from 1 to 6, and each township in a core to periphery zone, core being closest to Chengdu and Chongqing, the major metropolises of the region, and then further out into the countryside. And do we see a spatial logic here? And even better than the previous matrix, I think we do. Down the right from most urban settlements to least, we see a progression of the the demographic impact. The cities were relatively protected in the scheme, and further out in the countryside, less so. And then across the bottom, the other way, where if you're closer to the cities, more in the core, you're less protected. And then further out in the countryside, echoing Gooch, in more difficult terrain, harder to get to you, harder to either enforce the policies or extract the grain from you. you have less of an impact. And it's the very lowest impact are kind of mid-range in both of those. So they're middle to smaller urban settlements as far out in the countryside as they can possibly get. And they see the least impact, not no impact, but the least impact during this period. That's the URC 4 and 5, CPZ, corporate free zone 7. All right, so that's a logic in one of these 9 macro regions. We also attempted this for the lower Yangtze. This is from our Hong Kong paper with some different techniques. In that analysis, the province still did matter. So Anhui was a uniquely difficult place to be. But even outside of that, the Skinnerian hierarchical regional systems variables do come into play in terms of predicting the impact of the famine. So this we need more work on, and we need to see if this really is transferable from one macro region to the next. I think it's entirely possible that we do have different stories in different regions, partly as a result of the politics. Politics certainly matters in this. It's not simply an economic function, but as the political geography imposes itself on the market geography, that's going to happen differently depending on where an area is in the hierarchical regional system. So that's where we stand at this point. A little confused about where to go next, but open to questions or suggestions. And then to let Skinner have almost the last word. He'd figured out back in 1964, 66, that the conflict between the market system and the administrative structure was the problem. That difference between 39,000 standard markets and 26,000 communes was going to be a problem. And even just not having any data from China, but just the occasional translated article that could find its way out of China, seeing that the number of communes was increasing in the early 60s as China came out of the famine and said, well, we got to fix the system. Let's break up some of these overly large structures and get closer to that number, 39,000, so that people are part of a marketing system they recognize, people they have social ties with, familial ties and forth, was the way out of the famine. A generation or two later, are those ties still salient? I think in some places in the countryside, the periodic markets that are the root of this still are important. Sometimes they're now tourist attractions, people from the city coming back to see how their grandparents used to go to the farmer's market. You all go to farmer's markets, they're pretty cool too. Does it still apply to today? We could talk about that, but my last word is this, that China's not the only country where differences between urban and rural, core and periphery might be shaping behavior or choices or experiences even today. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
We are regional scholars and also regional system scholars and geographers. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more. Thank you, Alex. If you could say a little bit more about the timing, how quickly this was rolled out initially. I didn't maybe didn't catch it.
Yeah, so the announcement of the Great Leap Forward happened in the summer of 1958. And by the end of that year, these communes were being established nationwide. So it was pretty sudden, and it happened, interestingly, if you think in terms of the agricultural year, during the harvest. So whatever they were harvesting in 1958 pretty much was planted before that level of agglomeration. But its collection and its distribution was under this new system. And one of the things you may have heard of this area was the communal kitchens. They didn't want families cooking for each other anymore, so they had the commune mess where you could go and get as much food. And it happened to be a pretty good year in a lot of China, so they had a lot of food. So, hey, eat all you want. Then by early 1958, in that season before planting, when you're sort of relying on last year's stores, they found a lot of these places were running short on food that quickly. So 6 months, 8 months after the announcement of the Great Leap, you're starting to get reports of famine in some places, and probably impacts on people's fertility choices for one thing. And then the conscription of labor to go work on these infrastructure projects also happened at that time. So couples could have been separated for extended periods while somebody gets sent off to another county to help dig a irrigation canal. So yeah, the onset was pretty quick.
I'm just gonna get a little, because I forgot to just mention, repeat the question for people
Oh,
online,
okay.
and apparently there's a lot of ringing happening to those online. So I don't know. But okay, Maddie raised her hand.
And we had a question back here. I'm trying to get to Zoom to make sure this is muted.
I think just the notion of how chaos, quick decision-making. It seems actually pretty remarkable that they recovered as quickly as they did.
Well, I mean, quickly or not, yeah, it was a few years. The other lesson here was that in the first year of the famine, there was not a lot of willingness to hear that things were going wrong. And then critics were silenced, were dismissed from office. And even as they tried to slow down the progressiveness, it was really a few more years before they came back and said, okay, we can't run the economy from Beijing in the same way. Go to you and then the online question. Yeah.
Oh, just a question on how there's parts of the demographic
This one, the question is about the. I had this on the impact on grain production. Is that what you're thinking of?
No, but just in, I guess, there's one on here. I guess this is not your chart.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So this, well, this is my chart. So to explain this chart, replicating Gooch's analysis with our data. So the axes here across the x-axis is terrain ruggedness, which is just a measurement. How bumpy is the digital elevation model for the area covered by a given prefecture? And then up the y-axis is the Great Leap demographic impact. So anything above 0 was fewer children, 100 was no children born in that cohort. So a lot of kind of flat lines here, not as striking as Gooch sort of made it out to be, but then we do see some areas where, oh yeah, okay, I'm starting to see some patterns at the county level.
I was just wondering, because how comparable do you think the Washington are going to be? Age standardized?
Yeah, well, so it's a national census, so the ages are collected under the same protocols for everybody, for every province. All we've done is extract from that what province or county were you in. So that should be comparable, and then it's the same digital elevation model for the country. So the spatial precision would be the same. Yeah. So Bill's the better person to ask about the reliability of Chinese census data from place to place. And I know when we got the 2000 census, we found there were a couple of counties where they mixed up variables, and so there could be errors in there. But I think just for the year at birth, I don't think we're aware of any major gaps in the reliability of the data. But do you have a thought?
I think maybe, Keith, you're asking about whether the demographic impact has been by place has been adjusted for the population composition across the age.
Today you can see in rural areas you have a lot more older folks in America.
So I think it's a question about what the measurement is on the y-axis.
Okay, so the yes.
fair to have migration patterns. And I think that that's operating in some areas more intensely than others. So you might have kind of systematic emptying of parts of the population, people in the teens and early 20s who are going someplace for jobs. So,
Yeah, so the comment is on the effect of migration. The census captures you where you are in 1982. It is just the very, very beginning of what's now mass migration. If this was the 2000 census, yeah, all of the 20-year-olds are gone.
Bill's voice is quite low, so people couldn't hear what he was saying.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So to reiterate, possible effect of migration at the time or by the time of the census on our numbers. And I think that's a fair point to make. It's, I think, not going to be as big of an issue in the 1982 census because of the timing in Chinese history, that there was a lot less of it, but not none. And we might get some clues about where that was happening more. I mean, I would think the Pearl River Delta would be suspect because we're starting to see the establishment of the special economic zones and people migrating. But by 1990, it's going to be a bigger area, and by 2000, it's going to be everywhere. So yeah, that would make tracking this forward in time that much harder. I'm going to stick with, I think 1982 is okay, but it is a fair question. Did we get to that? Okay, and there was a question online, I think. Is there, can they unmute themselves, or how do we do that?
No, Steve Harrell is online.
Oh, hi, Steve.
I didn't see, mostly it's about the sound and the mics and everything.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions, or, yes, Aria?
I have a question on, I thought about how it's working.
Yeah, Tibet and Xinjiang are off the far corners of my map, and that's partly because the policies are not being rolled out uniformly in those areas. The timing of the Chinese march into Tibet is around this time, but they weren't like collectivizing in the same way. If anything, they were establishing state farms and trying to get the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, there to be more self-sufficient. But it's a really different dynamic. So yeah, Xinjiang and Tibet Autonomous Region turned out to have fairly low demographic impact on this, but they have other concerns. So.
Do any of our quantitative folks have any thoughts on modeling this, or I have a question about what do you think might be going on or not going on?
I'm going to try to think like Skinner and say you have to understand it within the overall landscape, but also you've got to bring in the politics, and probably it does matter who your governor was and who your local leader was, and their experience in the revolution and their ties, personal ties and expectations of what they would deliver or what they would commit to in a meeting where they're saying how much grain will you provide for the revolution, for industrialization. So all of the above is the right answer, but I think there is an underlying spatial logic here, and you're not going to understand it without that.
Dan.
It's not very interesting to be shot. Great show that earlier attribute that to those earlier colonization wasn't working or
I think that was a big part of it, actually. Also, ending a civil war that had raged on for a long time has got to help. There's a bit of a population boom, but also just the soldiers coming back home and starting to work the fields again, things like that, all factor in. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the earlier collectivization mutual aid teams that were voluntary, especially with people from your neighborhood, they might be your in-laws and so forth, that those would be more efficient than each family farming its little tiny plot. And then the sharp difference when collectivization is no longer voluntary, you can't leave, or if you leave, you're leaving everything that your family gave to the collective. And then the scale of it. it seems that there's a tipping point in there.
Yeah, Bill.
This is a question. Harvests and yields were places where there was a lot of starvation because the state was over conscripting grain. Now, Marx got a kind of a crossing of coal periphery and urban index there that shows pretty clearly that the more core areas and more urbanized areas of China, which are presumably more directly under state control, are also the ones that are suffering the greatest effect of famine, and rural areas, more rural areas have a full famine effect. Now, I know I'm stating what is already stated. I just want to emphasize this is pretty powerful empirical evidence for the hypothesis that this was administratively created famine.
So for those of you online, underscoring, and I completely agree that it was the grain procurement as a key instigator of the famine and the impact that we see here, and that the grain procurement was most avaricious, is that the word? Extreme in the areas that the state had the greatest control over and that were proximate geographically to the urban centers that they wanted to support. We also see that in the dates of the worst points in the famine. So the dates, the famine was at its worst at the beginning in the areas just outside the city, then it expanded outwards later, and then it got to the cities last when they sort of gave up or they ratcheted back those grain procurements, or there was resistance to delivering those grain procurements, which is also something worth investigating.
Thanks, Mark, for the inspirational talk. I have one question, more from a GIS perspective. I think one thing we were talking about the geographic patterns, we always think about like modifiable unit. Something more practical like the German usage. For your observation, especially I pretty enjoy is when you think about the linkage between the nasty hierarchical structure with the fuzzy hierarchical structure. So I was wondering about what's your perception, why you propose this kind of thinking about these differences. And for me, I feel this is really interesting because as geographers, we really look at how the internal structure influence, especially political and social. But your work is more thinking about the way external influence levels and the scale. So I just want to learn more about that.
Yeah, so everybody's familiar with this idea that where you draw the boundaries really matters in a geographic analysis. And if you modify those boundaries, that's the modifiable aerial unit problem, and summarize the data within a different polygon, you get different statistical results. Skinner's point about any studies of China that relied on provinces as the spatial container, we're going to get the wrong answer if the phenomenon was really working on a macro regional scale. And so we're trying it both ways, which really works. And I showed more of the provinces here as data containers, but for a regional analysis to work in terms of macro regions, because that's where the fuzzy hierarchy of networks exists. But politics also matters here too. You know, you can't go partway into Anhui and ignore the other half of the province. The other, besides provinces, there are these grain planning coordination areas that were sort of arranged as clusters of prefectures. Those might turn out to be a key level too. So yes, you have to wrestle with that like constantly and see what phenomena makes sense. It sure helps if you can get more finely aggregated data so that you can build up your analysis to the area that you want to study. And so townships are good that way, but again, they're a sample. Counties are okay. Prefectures are kind of big and funky, and maybe there's a lot of things going on in a prefecture that, especially if you're using Qing Dynasty prefectures instead of 1958 prefectures that don't, that would corrupt your analysis.
All right, one more question.
I have a question about how does the ecosystem fit in with this, with the fact that, at least I was just double checking when was that established, and I guess I'm wondering how that may play into. So because the huko attached, you know, I think it was attached to an individual. People were individually linked to a huko, and that impacted where they had, like, what they had access to and where they could go. So I guess I'm just wondering how that played into some role in terms of this geography.
Yes, I haven't used that phrase, huko, but the household registration system that comes into play here, everybody's registered as this sort of a citizen of their commune, which puts them into this nested hierarchy. If somebody from a commune wanted to go to Shanghai to like trade, they could not buy grain, they couldn't buy rice to eat in Shanghai. They had to bring it with them from the commune because they didn't have the right ID to, under the system, to have basic necessities. And the example I give is if like you were assigned to your local neighborhood Starbucks, and if you wanted to have coffee when you were traveling, you had to bring the beans with you and have them ground up there to prepare for you because you didn't have the right ID number to get from a different Starbucks. So that's critically important here. It's part of why people couldn't just up and leave their communes in case of the famine. And it's partly why in 1982, we think we're kind of okay not worrying too much about migration because there was that barrier to easy migration out of your township. Now, here we are, we've been saying for 50 years that they're going to get rid of the system and they haven't quite done it yet. It is certainly, there's a lot more migration now and there isn't a grain rationing system now, but at the time that was a really big driver of keeping people in their container, in their nested system.
Actually, we have Steve Harrell question.
Yes,
and
please, Steve.
I can't deny Steve. So Steve asks, and he put it in the Q&A for the webinar, and I missed that. So have you measured GLDI against raw grain production figures? Are those data available? Also, are there any data on causes of declines in grain production? Two hypotheses might be labor mobilization for distant projects versus adoption of new agricultural practices such as deep tilling and closed planting.
Yes, somebody should do that. So I only have grain production at the national level, which is not terribly useful here. If anybody's got it at the prefectural or the county level in a reliable form, that would be great. Of course, the grain production numbers that were reported at the time were entirely influenced by the political pressure to overstate what you had. And that fed the extraction of more grain than you even had into the system. So if we could recreate reliable actual grain production figures for the time period, that would be extremely helpful. And we may find that maybe the grain production wasn't the problem, it was the extraction that was the problem. And then similarly, we probably could start tracking some of the major projects, just how many laborers were taken out of the fields and sent off to do irrigation. In what areas was the deep tillage a really bad idea, and how did that impact? But without that really disaggregated grain production figure, I don't have something to compare it with, but someday.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fun. So there's a lunch with students afterwards.
And they use 21, and Maria will walk you as well as you and us over to the